Hi everyone, hope you're doing well today. So Allison braided my hair this morning. So I'm titling this video Pre-Calc in Pigtails. Whoop whoop. Anyway, so today we're gonna finish our study of identities with half angle identities. So if you look at the top of the page, you'll see that there are several options. So one of them says sine of x over 2, one says cosine of x over 2, one says tangent of x over 2. Actually, there's a second one that does. So these all imply that these angles are half angles. So I'm going to show you today how you would find their values. So you'll notice on number 1 that they give us a value, cosine of x equals 15/17. Okay, so we'll need that information, of course. Cosine of x is 15/17. All right, and then it says that the angle x is somewhere between 3 pi over 2 and 2 pi. So that implies that we are going to make a reference triangle in one of the 4 quadrants. So of course 3 pi over 2 is down here on the bottom and 2 pi is over here on the right. So that would mean that our angle x is in quadrant 4. So go ahead and just pick an angle in quadrant 4, label that x, drop a perpendicular to the x-axis, and we have our reference triangle. And in SOHCAHTOA, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So that would put the 15 up here, adjacent to the x. And the hypotenuse will be here, 17. Okay, as usual, we would need to do the Pythagorean theorem to find the missing side because we'll need that later to find some of our values. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to scoot this over a bit. Kind of hard to manage this whiteboard at sometimes. Okay, so we're going to do Pythagorean theorem, x squared plus y squared equals r squared. Okay, so that would be 15 squared plus, this would be y, and we don't know what it is, so it's going to be y squared. And then 17 is the hypotenuse or radius. Okay. So 15 squared would be 225. Y squared we don't have yet, and 17 squared is 289. So then we would subtract over the 225 and we would have y squared equals 64. And after we take the square root, it would be plus or minus 8. Okay, so then we have to look at our drawing to see which would be appropriate in this case. So we have a triangle in quadrant 4, which the piece is going down from the x-axis. So that would mean that this would have to be a -8. Okay. Now, a couple of the identities, if you look at them, the sine of x over 2 and the cosine of x over 2, they have plus and minus signs in front of them. So when you do your work, you're not going to use plus and minus. You're going to have to choose which one is necessary. So here's how this will go. Now keep in mind this is angle x, but we're trying to find the value for x divided by 2, or half of this angle. So we have to figure out if we took half of the angle, which quadrant would our angle be in? So keep in mind the original angle was somewhere in between 3 pi over 2 and 2 pi. So what we will have to do is think what would be half of this and half of this. So what is half of 3 pi over 2? Well, taking half of something means multiplying by a half. So if I were to do 1 times 3 pi, that would still be 3 pi. 2 times 2 is 4. In the middle, half of x would be 1/2 x. And on the other side, if I took half of that, half of 2 pi would just be pi. Okay, so our half angle is going to be somewhere between 3 pi over 4 and pi. Well, 3 pi over 4 is in quadrant 2, and then pi is over here. So that means our angle, half angle, would be over here in quadrant 2. So here would be x over 2. Now we don't need to know the values of this triangle, like we don't have to label all the sides, but what we have to remember is what is positive and what is negative in that quadrant. So think of the phrase that I taught you earlier this year, all students take calculus. That was a memory device to remember which values are positive in which quadrant. So all students, remember students represent sign, so that means that the sign in quadrant 2 is positive. And then the cosine is negative, and also the tangent is negative. So that's what you're going to use as you figure out the identities on the rest of this problem. So we're going to use these values in quadrant 4, but when we give our answers, we want the sign to be positive and the cosine and tangent to be negative. Okay, so let's get to the work then. And I know I'm going to run out of room here, so I'm going to just erase what I just went over. So pause the video and catch up if you need to. Okay, so we're going to first do the sine of x over 2. X over 2. That's the half angle. So notice that the identity has a plus and a minus, and then a radical. And then it's 1 minus cosine of x over 2. Okay, so as I was saying a minute ago, you're not going to use both plus and minus. You're going to have to look at the quadrant where the half angle is. Quadrant 4 is where the original angle is. The half angle is over here in quadrant 2. So the sign is positive in quadrant 2. So that means when we do this work, we're going to use the positive value in this case. So it's going to be 1 minus the cosine of x is given 15/17. And then that has to be divided by 2. Okay, so whether you use a calculator or not, you have to be careful, because if you try to put all that in at once, you'll probably not get the right answer. So just do this a little bit at a time. If you were to think of 1 as 17 over 17, and then you subtract 15 over 17, you would get 2 over 17. And then keep in mind that dividing by 2 is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. So it would be the same thing as multiplying by a half. That would make the 2's cancel out, and you would have the square root of a fraction, 1/17. Now you can't leave a square root with a fraction inside, so you have to simplify this further. So think of the two numbers separately. The square root of 1 would be 1, and the square root of 17 you would leave as the radical. Now you also learned, as in previous math classes, not to leave a radical in the denominator of a fraction. So you would have to rationalize by multiplying the numerator and the denominator by square root of 17. So now if you multiply straight across, you would get the square root of 17 over 17. And that would represent the sine of 2x. So your final answer for sine of x over 2, I should have said, is square root of 17 over 17. Okay, so pause and restart if you need to. I'm going to erase this part right here. Okay, so that was the sine of x over 2. Okay, so now the cosine of x over 2. So if you look at the identity at the top of the page, it's plus or minus the square root. And we have 1 plus cosine of x over 2. Now again, you're not going to use plus and minus. You have to remember that the half angle is in quadrant 2. And in quadrant 2, the cosine is negative. So when you start doing the work, you're going to use the negative value this time. So it's going to be the negative square root 1 plus 15/17 divided by 2. And again, be careful if you use a calculator or without. Either way, you have to make sure you do it correctly. So there would be a negative sign on the outside. Think of 1 as 17/17. If you were to add 17 and 15, you would get 32/17. And dividing by 2 means multiplication by half. So you can make this a little simpler by canceling the 2 with the 32. 2 goes into 32 16 times. So now if you multiply across, you would have 16 over 17, still inside of the radical. Okay, so you cannot leave the fraction inside of the radical. You'll have to simplify further. So think of the two numbers separately. The square root of 16 is 4, And I'm going to use negative because of this over here. So I'm going to put -4. And I'm going to keep the square root of 17 there for now. And then I will need to rationalize it. So after you rationalize, you would get -4 square root 17 over 17. And that would represent the cosine of x over 2, or half of x. Okay, so there's one more part to number 1. That would be the tangent of x over 2. So there are 2 different identities, and it really doesn't matter which one you choose because it will work out the same either way. So the tangent of x over 2 would be 1 minus the cosine of x divided by sine of x. Now this one doesn't have a plus or minus symbol in it. This will work itself out if you do the work correctly, but it should be that the tangent of our answer will be negative based on what we wrote earlier. Okay, so let's see how that works out. So we would have 1 minus 15/17. Now in the denominator, we have the sine of x. We haven't needed that yet, but we should be able to get it easily based on our drawing. So sine in SOHCAHTOA is opposite over hypotenuse. So compared to x, that would be the -8 over the 17. So -8/17. Okay, so again, think of that 1 as 17 over 17. So 17 minus 15 would be 2/17, and then a -8/17 on the bottom. And when you divide fractions, you should multiply by the reciprocal. So keep 2/17 the same and flip the bottom one. I'm just going to put the negative symbol on the top. So then I'm going to cancel out the 17s, and be careful of the negative sign, that's still there. That would be -2/8 if I multiplied straight across. And then if you reduce -2/8, you would have -1/4. So your final answer for number 1 for tangent of x over 2 is -1/4. So when you get to the end of the problem, be careful of your signs and go back to quadrant 2 where we wrote everything down. Just make sure in your final answer that the sine is positive, the cosine is negative, and the tangent is negative, because the half angle is in quadrant 2. The original angle was in quadrant 4, but the half angle is in quadrant 2. Okay, so that does it for number 1. So we're going to do the same thing for number 2, just a different set of information at the beginning. So number 2 says that the sine of x is -3/5, and it also says that our angle is somewhere between pi and 3 pi over 2. Okay, so making a sketch of that, pi would be here on the left, 3 pi over 2 down here, so that puts our angle somewhere in quadrant 3. That'll be labeled x. Make your triangle by dropping a perpendicular to the x-axis. Then think of SOHCAHTOA with your -3/5, so sine is the opposite over the hypotenuse. So compared to x, opposite would put the -3 over here, and the hypotenuse would put the 5 right here. Later, we're going to need this value, so we'll have to do the Pythagorean theorem to get it. So let's figure that out real quick. So that's x squared plus -3 squared will equal 5 squared. So -3 squared is 9, 5 squared is 25, and subtract the 9. X squared will be 16. Then we'll take the square root, and x will be plus or minus 4. Now look at the drawing, we're in quadrant 3, so the piece that we're missing is going to the left of the x-axis, so that would mean that our value must be negative, so that would be a -4. Okay, so now I need to figure out if that's the original angle, where is the half angle found? So you're going to go back to here and you're going to think, what is half of everything? So what is half of pi? Half of pi would be pi over 2. Half of x would be x over 2. And what is half of 3/2? Again, you can multiply by half and go straight across, and you would see it's 3 pi over 4. So our half angle is somewhere in between pi over 2 and 3 pi over 4. So keep in mind that pi over 2 is up here, and 3 pi over 2 is in quadrant 2. So that means our angle must be somewhere in quadrant 2. So I'm going to need to erase that because I sort of drew in the area I need to draw the triangle in. So I'm going to get rid of that. We're going to draw our half angle in quadrant 2. I'm also going to move this -4 just down here so I can see that that's part of the first triangle. Okay, so in this second quadrant, you're going to have another angle, and this will be the half angle. And you don't need to know any of the values for that. That's what we're going to find. But you just need to know if sine, cosine, and tangent are positive or negative. So let's go again. Remember, the phrase is all students take calculus. So all students, second quadrant, tells us that sine is positive. And then that would mean that the other two are negative. So we'll need to keep that in mind when we do the rest of the work. Okay, so for instance, on this problem, we're trying to find the sine of x over 2. The identity has a plus and minus sign, and then it's 1 minus cosine of x over 2. Now you're not going to use both plus or minus. You have to use what matches the quadrant that the half angle is in. So that would be quadrant 2, and we said that the sign should be positive. So in this case, we are only using the positive value. So it's going to be the positive square root. So then it's 1 minus the cosine of x. So you'll have to go back to the drawing, the triangle, and see what the cosine of x is. Now keep in mind, this is the original x, so it's the angle that's in quadrant 3. So in SOHCAHTOA, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So that would mean the -4 is adjacent, and the hypotenuse would be 5. Okay, so then we're going to work this out. Now keep in mind that when you have subtraction by a negative number, it's really addition. So if you want to change this to plus and this to plus, that will make it easier. The other thing is the 1. 1 is the same thing as 5 over 5 in this case. So if you were to add 5/5 plus 4/5, that would be 9/5. And then dividing that by 2 is the same thing as multiplying by a half. So in this case, nothing cancels, so just multiply straight across and you would get 9 over 10. And you would not be able to leave your answer in that form, so we would need to simplify that radical. So think of the two numbers separately. The square root of 9 is 3. The square root of 10 we'll leave for now, but we can't leave the radical in the denominator, so we will rationalize. Multiply both the top and the bottom by square root of 10. So multiplying straight across, we would have 3 square root of 10 over 10. And that will represent the sine of x over 2, or half of x. So final answer is right there. Okay, I'm going to need to erase some of this, so pause the video if you need to catch up. Okay, so now we're doing the cosine of x over 2, and the identity is plus or minus 1 plus cosine of x over 2. Okay, so you won't use both plus and minus. You have to look at the picture to see where the half angle is. So the half angle is in quadrant 2, and we said earlier that that means that the cosine value is negative. So we're going to use a negative in front of that radical. Okay, so we're going to fill in our values. So it's 1 plus cosine of x, we discussed earlier, is -4/5. And then divide that by 2. So I'm going to change the 1 to 5 over 5 again. and see what we get. So it's the negative square root of, so 5/5 plus negative 4/5 would be 1/5. And then dividing by 2 is the same thing as multiplying by 1/2. So if I multiply straight across, I would get 1/10, which you cannot leave in that form. So think of the two numbers separately. The square root of 1 would be 1. I'm just going to use -1 because of this sign back here. So -1 over the square root of 10 will have to be rationalized, of course. So your answer will be negative square root of 10 over 10. And that represents the cosine of x over 2, half of x. So one more thing and then we'll be finished for today. So we have to do the tangent of x over 2. So there are two identities. It really doesn't matter which one. I'm just going to use the second one just to show you an example of that. But either way, you would get the same answer. So it's sine of x over 1 plus cosine of x. Okay, so we were given in the original problem that sine of x is equal to negative 3/5. And in the denominator, it's 1 plus, and the cosine of x is negative 4/5 again. And you can change the 1 to 5/5 again. Okay, so it's negative 3/5 divided by, and then 5/5 plus negative 4/5 would be 1/5. And when you divide fractions, you multiply by the reciprocal. So the reciprocal of 1/5 is 5 over 1. And you'll notice that the 5's cancel out, and you're left with just -3. It's -3 over 1, but you don't need to write the 1. Just put -3. So that would represent the tangent of x over 2. Okay, so before you stop, just make sure that the signs that you figured out earlier should match. So was your sine answer positive? Was your cosine answer negative? Was your tangent answer negative? And as long as that's good, you should be okay. All right, so hope y'all are doing well, and I'll talk to you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.